Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening about new democracy entitled Resilient Democracy in the 21st Century. My name is Natasja van den Berg and I'm the host of this series. And we are in this series, New Democracy, our 25th edition. So it's a bit of a celebration for the team because in 25 evenings we have analyzed democracy in many ways. And our central question is our democracy in transition? Traditional democratic institutions such as elections or political parties are decreasing in effective power and appreciation. Other players like citizen initiatives, social entrepreneurs and cooperatives are more and more taking up responsibility for the public good. But is this a time of fundamental change? With New Democracy, we research democratic renewal as a transition phenomenon. A transition comes about when a landscape of socio-economic trends and a niche of experiments and, well, small pilots, innovative practices jointly build up pressure high enough to change the existing regime, the existing system. And we look at the effect of transitions in many areas. We've looked at transition in energy, or in housing, or in area development or care. And we ask, what does that tell us about how we should organize our democracy? And at the same time, we also look in transition within democracy itself as a precondition for the coming about of transition in other domains. This series is a joint initiative of Pakhuis de Zwijger and Netwerk Democratie, our fantastic partner, and we will drink, I'm looking at the partners, yeah, tonight, because this is our 25th evening, and I've hosted, I think, more than 20 of them. So it's a bit of a party tonight. And tonight, this evening, we have another partner. It's International IDEA, and we will discuss their Global State of Democracy publication, which is about innovating constitutional rights and checks and balances. Because democracy is not a given. It's an as one of our fantastic thinkers of democracy, Herman Tjeek-Willink, says, it's a verb. It's an ongoing project, especially in the face of challenges such as populism, growing inequality, or the changing nature of representation. How democracies worldwide cope with these shared challenges has been researched in many years already by the Global State of Democracy publication by the International IDEA. And tonight we will look at the state of Dutch democracy. Are our institutions, rights and checks and balances still up to date, or do we need to innovate? Where can we find possibilities for innovations which are broad or put on the agenda from bottom up? Has, for instance, Urgenda's climate case the potential of introducing new constitutional rights that make our democracy more future-proof? Do we need to secure the position and influence of participation in law? First, tonight, we will look at this new publication, the Global State of Democracy publication. And then we will have two rounds of discussion. The first we will look at, first round we will talk about constitutional rights and innovating them. And the second will be about participatory or the functioning of our representative democracy. This evening is part of a day of research talks. Many of you have, I think, participated in that. Who've participated this day in the workshops? Okay, so the others are here for only tonight. So for those who were in the workshops, please share your knowledge with the other people who haven't attended, and we will make sure at the end of the evening you haven't missed anything. And then at the end we will come with some, we will end with some joint conclusions. New Democracy has developed some rules of engagement for the audience, you. Because we really like the participation of the audience. If we have a series about democracy, we cannot shut people from speaking, of course. I mean, you really should express your ideas, your notions about what you think are important ideas for innovating democracy. But we have, well, constructed a model for that, and that is this mic and this table. And the rule is, there are two rules. The first rule is that if you engage, if you want to engage in the conversation, you come to this place, and you really engage in the conversation. So, for instance, it's not really allowed to say, 25 minutes ago, I heard something, and I want to reflect on that. Because then, 25 minutes ago, you should have reflected on that. Because then you really stop the conversation as it already has developed. But you participate in the ongoing conversation, and as long as the point you raised is discussed, you join the conversation, you stay here at this place, and if you feel your point has been, well, fairly been discussed, you just go back to your seat, and that opens the room for somebody else to participate in the conversation, because the second rule is that you cannot queue. So there's not allowed that there are 25 people standing here because you all want to say something. Because that really doesn't help us getting a good, informal, in-depth conversation. So 2 rules. 1, join the conversation, really join the conversation. 2, no queuing. And for the rest, there's no rule. So if you want to stand here the entire evening and everybody is fine with that, feel free. Yeah? Okay. The entire conversation will be in the chairs there. So it's kind of a laid back, in Dutch you would say, feet on the table conversation. It's informal, and we really try to get a conversation going. It's not about talking points. It's really about listening and interaction. And then in, well, about 2 hours we'll end this evening. And I hope we have all learned a lot. Let's kick off with the first speaker who will introduce this global state of democracy. His name is Svend-Erik, and he is a professor in political science at Aarhus University in Denmark. And he focuses there on the conceptualization, measurement, and explanation of democracy and human rights. And he's one of the GSOD indices experts. These indices depict democratic trends at country, regional, and global level across a broad range of attributes of democracy in the period 1975, the year I was born, and 2015, so 40 years. I hope you will all welcome him with a big applause. Professor Svend-Erik Skaning. He's really at the So, Mr. Skaning, I probably do not pronounce it correct.
That's perfectly fine. Yeah.
Oh, really?
In Danish, it's actually skåning.
Skåning. I'm going to do that. Skåning.
Yeah.
I probably will forget it, but yeah. Skåning, it's nice. Yeah. Mr. Skåning. Yeah. In this series, we always have conversations and never presentations. Mm-hmm. But of course, if you want to present the content of a very interesting, in-depth study, it sometimes is useful to have slides. So you brought slides.
I brought some slides. I was allowed to. Yeah.
So this is the first slide already, and you have your own clicker.
Yep, that's right. Yeah.
Is it there?
Yeah.
So if you feel that a slide supports our talk, feel free to click around.
Thanks.
But let's start with the first basic question. How is democracy doing worldwide?
It's doing much better than most people tend to think. Because if you look at the current discourse that is floating around, you get the impression, opening newspapers every day, that democracy is on decline.
We're in crisis.
Totally crisis.
Yeah.
But I think, in my view, and I've done some research on this, is mainly due to people exaggerating the negative cases and forgetting about the positive things we see around the world. So people think Turkey, Hungary, Venezuela, and so on, but tend to forget
the United States of America.
And of course, it's a question there how bad things are really going. So you can be disappointed with the policies that are going on and so on. But is this really a matter of democracy as such, or is it more that we dislike the policies that are taking place? So this is the general impression that people have. Yeah. But I would say there is a kind of a particular bias. So people tend to be confirmed with the kind of first impressions that they have. But if we look at some numbers that we have collected for our volume here, things tend to look pretty good. So if we look from the beginning in 75 until 2016, where this overview ends, there's been a sudden, a very big increase in the number of democracies around the world. And this is based on a minimalist understanding of democracy. There are only kind of three criteria.
So what is the minimalist
They have to be fulfilled. So there have to be free elections.
Yeah.
Those who win the elections have to win, and they have to be kind of undertaken on a continuous basis.
Yeah.
But here we see that more than 60% of all countries in the world have democratically elected governments. And often when I give a presentation like this, people would ask, oh, what about China? This would totally drag down this number. But there are other countries such as India and Brazil that would point in the other direction. So if we look at the population living under democratic rule, it's also up to about 60%. So things are not looking that bad.
Yeah, so that is in general. You say, okay, although in newspapers you sometimes get the first impression we're in a crisis, it's actually on a global scale looking pretty good.
Yeah, so what one could say is that things could be better, of course.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as a complete democracy in the world these days.
There's no complete democracy in the world.
No, and there are still autocracies, as we know, of course, Russia, China, et cetera. Zimbabwe has kind of taken headlines recently. But in looking at this historically, the world is as democratic as it has ever been.
One of the notions in your report is resilience. Mm-hmm. What does that mean, resilience?
So with resilience, it means that the ability to cope with, survive, and recover from challenges and crises of democracy. So, if a political system, a democracy is able to do that, you can say it's resilient or consolidated. So even though it's facing an economic crisis or whatever, then it can actually handle that and come out on the other side, still being a democracy and maybe even being a stronger democracy.
Yeah, So can you break it down in the analysis of democracy? I mean, you look at 5 pillars of democratic functioning. What are the 5 pillars?
Yeah, so we have what we call the 5 attributes of democracy. So we have representative government, all the stuff about free parties and elections, and everybody is allowed to vote, etc. Then we have fundamental rights, where we have access to justice, civil liberties, but also economic and social equalities. Then we have checks on government. So we have independent courts. We have effective parliaments that can check the governments, and we have some pluralistic and free media that can also control the government.
Yeah.
Then we also have, this is kind of an add-on that most overviews do not capture, but what we call impartial administration, because we think it's important not only to look at the input of the system, but also whether the decisions actually made by the citizens and the politicians together, are they implemented in the fashion they should be?
Yeah.
So is there kind of impartial and effective administration without corruption? And then we have the last dimension is the popular participation. So in what ways and how much do citizens actually engage in politics on an everyday basis?
Yeah, and if you look at the development of democracy in these 5 pillars or attributes, do you see the same trend? It's getting better and better in the entire world?
So we see so for most of them. There is one that stands out a little bit, and that's the impartial administration. So that's more a flat line. So we see kind of gradual or steep increases in the other attributes. With impartial administration, is basically a flat line on a global level. So things haven't become much worse, but they haven't improved much.
So although from, let's say, 30% until 60%, so democracies have doubled for corruption or the quality of impartial bureaucracy, that is not the case.
No, so basically of course there are changes in individual countries for the better or the worse, but on a global scale there's not much improvement to see. And this could be one of the reasons for some of the frustration and distrust that we see in many new democracies, but also maybe in some of the old democracies. Or if the democracies are not able to deliver public goods, in an efficient and a non-corrupt way, of course people get dissatisfied.
People could say, well, nice that you have to check all boxes, but if the consequences of all these institutions are unfair policies, then we haven't reached any real democracy.
Yeah, and what we can see is that, of course, people have high expectations for democracy. We've seen many new democracies that people don't only think that they are allowed now to vote people into office, also that it would make a difference for their kind of everyday life.
Yeah.
And to the extent that this is not the case, they get disappointed. And sometimes they get disappointed for good reasons, but other times they also may be demanding a little bit too much from the system. So if you have a really totally corrupt state from the outline, it takes a lot to reform that, and you just see it, for example, the Dutch Western European experience is that it took centuries to develop the strong and efficient states that we have today.
Yeah. So in the Netherlands, sometimes in polling or in research, it's said that although politicians are not trusted. About 30% of the people really trust politicians, but the democratic system as such is really supported now, above 90%. Yeah. Is the support of people for democratic institutions, has risen as well in the last decades?
So that has actually been quite stable. So it means that previously there has been a large discrepancy between the actual conditions and what people, the kind of rule they were living under. So now there's an alignment between that, because in almost all countries of the world there's a large majority for democracy as the best system to live under. I think the problem is more that if you ask many people and more specific questions about democratic rights, so should there be opposition parties allowed? Should the media be free and also kind of be allowed to spread news that you would dislike and so on? Then there's a more variation going on, and so people on the more abstract level, they are very supportive, but they also have to be supportive of the more concrete democratic rights before it matters.
Okay. And so this evening is part of a global tour you take as an organization, right? The international idea is having all these conversations in the countries they research.
Yeah.
So you actually researched our country?
Well, I must say that for my own sake, I'm very much a comparativist. So I'm flying a little bit above the waters, many countries and many years and so on. But I can tell you a little about the Netherlands, how it's doing.
You can.
We can go back to the other slides later. So let's see how the Netherlands is performing. So we can look at representative government. This is kind of the more classical understanding of democracy, with free elections and so on. So the red line is the Netherlands. The blue line is kind of northwestern Europe, including Germany, Austria, Belgium, the Scandinavian countries. Countries that the Netherlands usually try to compare with. And you see they compare for a good reason, so they do basically the same. These are not distinguishable from each other. Of course, this could be seen as a positive or a negative sign, so you're not doing much better than your neighboring countries, but none of them are doing much better.
It's not the Netherlands first, no.
But also not last. They're doing pretty good. And looking at the kind of the global trend, you see that the positive developments, but still Netherlands is still far above the global level. And the same thing is now today's topic was checks and balances. So if we look at this with independent courts, effective parliament that controls the government, and media integrity, the Netherlands is also doing very good, same level as other kind of high-performing democracies of the world.
And am I overreaching if I would like to ask an analysis of that little
dip down here?
What happens in 2013?
Yeah, it's very interesting. However, I wouldn't put too much emphasis on this, because I haven't put it in these figures, but we work with statistical uncertainty in our measurement.
I was already afraid.
And this dip is totally within the limits of that. So this could have something to do with changing some of our coders and the procedures and so on. So, yeah.
That's not one decision.
This is not necessarily a red flag. And if it's a red flag, you are not the only ones experiencing this.
Thanks. Yeah. So this is the second.
And then we have the last. And this
Yeah.
is maybe where there's a little bit,
Interesting.
from our numbers, a little bit more varying trends, both on this developed democracies and in the Netherlands. So this is electoral participation.
Yeah.
So basically the turnout rates at
Yeah.
national elections. And this is probably not news to the enlightened audience that we have here, but there has been a decline in the Netherlands and many other northwestern countries also. Whereas we have seen an increase on the global level, but this is mostly due to countries that would previously not hold any elections. They have started holding elections, so they would go up from 0 and of course pull up the average.
Yeah. Is this worrying? Is this something we should be worried about?
Yes, to some degree, but I think from a democratic point of view, the most important thing is that those who vote and engage are representative of the whole population.
Yeah.
It's more important that many participate, that they actually represent all interests in society. And the reason why this is probably worrying is that there is a bias to who participates or not. And with the decline, there's particular groups that do not participate and do so less and less. So this would be the young people, and it would be probably kind of
lower income
second and third generation immigrants, also and low income groups. Yeah. So these would be the three groups that kind of stand out as voting less than the average.
Yeah, but also those groups themselves actually.
This would be kind of reinforced because these are the groups that would less and less.
And that's a trend in the entire Northwest Europe.
Yeah, very much so. You have very few exceptions. Denmark, where I come from, and Sweden, as pretty much stayed on a kind of mid-80s, so 85% participation. But in most other countries, Switzerland, France, have even higher declines than in the Netherlands on this factor.
So I already asked you that resilience is an important notion in your analysis. So how would you give, what would you say the Dutch democracy is resilient?
Very much so. So in a very big perspective, the Dutch democracy is one of the most resilient that you see in the world, basically. It's probably in the top 10.
Are you wondering why we have 25 conversations about new democracy here?
No, because I think it's very important to do so, because that is what
part of making a...
But that's actually what makes one of the things that makes Dutch democracy so vibrant is that people engage in these conversations. I would worry more if you didn't have those conversations, and then you would probably maybe fall out of the top 10.
So the analysis of that we are talking about, is democracy in transition, for you is proof that our democracy is resilient.
It's not the only proof.
No,
so there's more evidence to it, but it's a good indication that things people are engaged, and I think democracy is important, and that's why people show up on a meeting like this.
Well, I want to go to the other slides in your, because you had some.
I have some of this might be a little bit interesting. So
there
has been talking about this negative discourse again, that democracy is on the decline on a global level. So what we show is that, well, there are of course countries that have seen a decline from 2005 to 2015, to make this 10-year comparison.
Yeah.
So Thailand with a military coup, Bangladesh has a lot of fundamentalism going on, so basic rights are violated. Turkey, we all know that case, of course. But then on the other hand, there are other countries pulling in the other direction, and the general pattern is that the best prediction is how a country is in 2015 is how it was in 2005. So there's a lot of stability going on. So the Netherlands is probably just placed on this diagonal, showing you are basically doing the same thing. Looking again at what we call horizontal accountability, or again the checks on government. Again, some countries, and they tend to be overlapping with those who do good and bad on representative government, have seen a decline, but other countries have seen an improvement. But again, the general pattern is one of stability.
Yeah.
And of course, the worrisome thing here is that there has not been much more improvement, because of course we would like to see much more democratic world than there is. So is the glass half full or half empty? So I'm an optimist, so I say it's half full.
It's more than half full, you actually
it's
say.
even more than, so
You said
66% full.
Yeah, it's quite a lot more than half, right? I mean, you would say actually it's full. There are some sips out of the glass, but generally it's going quite well.
Yeah, but that would be according to kind of some minimalist criteria.
Yeah.
If you want to go all in to have a perfect democracy, it's probably not half.
No, not even half, of course. No. Okay. So if you would give in your report, of course, in the global stage, you give some recommendation, right? I mean, what would be the steps which really benefit us the most in democratizing the world?
So, well, first of all, we identify a number of challenges. And I try to emphasize a few of those who could be relevant also in the Dutch context. So, as I showed before, the decline in electoral participation, and also the way we think parties, and certainly also in the Netherlands, you have seen a decline in the number of party members for the different parties.
Is that a trend which is...
It's very much a trend in all the countries in the world, basically.
Because in the Netherlands now, 2% of the population is member of a political party.
I think that's very representative of kind of alike countries, and it's very low. But people tend to engage in other ways, and civil society organizations tend to be very vibrant in the Netherlands and these other countries. But of course, political parties play still a major role in our political systems, so this could be something to worry about.
We're going to talk about it.
And another thing is that, of course, we know that the democratic ideal is that every citizen has equal saying in political matters. And even though every citizen has a vote, this is not the case in any democracy that we know. So there's still that the way that money and power transitions into political influence as well. That's something we see in every political system, and we could try to improve those things. And one of the things, of course, that matters for this is the inequality in society and exclusion of particular groups in society. Yeah. So we have, this is also, there are kind of hundreds of recommendations in the report, so I picked a few ones that might appeal to the Dutch case and the audience here. So issues like having as much transparency as possible about the income of political parties, members of parliament, and all that. So even though you're living in a low corrupt society, it's really just to keep it that way, make more improvements. Also, because there's always a distance between the general population and the politicians. So in order to really, the more transparent you are, the less things the citizens think could be hidden under the carpet, and there could be a higher trust based on that. Another thing that is emphasized in the report is that try to meet people, and especially those who are not engaged as much at their level. So what are they occupied with? So this is the second thing about using these digital tools, interactive websites and apps to engage the youth. Sure. And I know several parties do so already and civil society organizations, but I'm sure that more could be done in this respect. Yeah. So, and of course, what we see, the worrying trends in some of the new EU members, for example, with trying to undermine the space for civil society organizations and undermine the opportunities for the opposition to really demonstrate and so on. Just the slightest sign of something going in that direction, try to get people into the streets and really mobilize and use all your networks and so on. Because only when people go together and stand together, we can push this back. And it's the earlier, the better.
Yeah, so you do not want demonstration to be blocked in the highway, for instance. No, okay. Jan, so then of course you try to, you ask some attention to the position of journalism, investigative journalism, as a countervailing power, or a check on the on governments, and then the civic space you already mentioned. I mean, we should be really about the right to demonstrate should really be protected.
Yeah. So okay. In all ways that people and civil society organizations and opposition parties are allowed to check power. Yeah. Basically, so it cannot be abused. That's important to uphold and even strengthen.
Okay, so since you have studied so in depth all these democracies, I'm gonna look at you sometimes during this evening, and if you think people are talking, they are lying, or they are misrepresenting facts, which you can actually prove because you have all these indices and all these, you can just nod, and I will give you the floor to explain what was misrepresented.
Okay, I'll be alert for the sake of democracy. Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you. Siewert, je bent iets later binnengekomen dat je naar de wereld draait door. Sorry, Siewert, you were you were in the program in the second table, but you were also supposed to react on this person in the program. But since you had to go to the wereld draait door, I think, or
yes.
Yeah, you were a bit late, which is fine. So your comments will be discussed in the second round, if that's okay. Okay, let's go to the two panel discussions we have prepared for tonight. And the first one is about innovating constitutional rights. We have three people at the table. Let me introduce them to you. The first is a lawyer at Hukker Advocaten. It's going to be a great evening for pronunciation of names. And he was one of the representatives, the lawyers of the Urgenda in the climate case, in which regular citizens have managed to hold their government accountable, our government accountable in the Netherlands, for taking insufficient action to keep them safe from dangerous climate change. And the District Court of The Hague, for those who didn't follow it closely, ruled, I think 1.5 years ago already, that the Dutch government is required to reduce emissions by at least 25% by the end of 2020. So that's already in 2 years. The Dutch government decided to appeal this historic verdict, and they are preparing the higher case, in the higher court case, and that will probably be in court in April or May 2018. Thank you. Koos van den Berg, I was already join the table, please. And since I will introduce the other people, but I have already announced that you're going to talk a little bit about introducing this climate case, because for those people who have missed the Dutch newspaper 1.5 years ago, because, for instance, they live in another country, although you made headlines all over the world, you'll get an introduction. The second person at the table is Rijer Paschier, and he's assistant professor in comparative constitutional law at Tilburg Universities, and he published articles on the importance of informal constitutional change in all kinds of very important peer-reviewed journals, which is really important if you're a scientist. Let's hear what that is, informal constitutional change. Give him a warm welcome, Rijer Paschier. Yes. And the last person in this panel discussion is a constitutional expert, one of the key authors of this CBP primers that help decision makers and citizens to understand and use some key constitutional principles. He used to be a research director of the Constitutional Commission and author of A Model Constitution of Scotland, Making Democracy Work in an Independent State. Give him a warm welcome, Elliot Balme. Thank you. So, dear gentlemen, welcome. In the next 45 minutes, we're going to look at some of the questions on how constitutional rights actually are they doing what they're supposed to do? Does it need work, innovation? What are we talking about then? What kind of rights are we missing, for instance? And what in practice can we do? So Mr. van den Berg, you were asked because, well, some would say, in my text I already say, it was an historic moment for climate activists as myself, it was. But also in constitutional law, perhaps. What was, in essence, the climate case? What is the climate case?
Yes. Well, we do have a climate problem, and I think the global community is aware of that, at least from 1990, because that's when an international treaty, the UNFCCC, was made. and it has 195 countries participating, which is the highest participation grade. And on the international, because climate change is a global problem, so the best way to tackle it is a global solution. But then you have to agree, the countries have to agree among each other on how much are you going to reduce your emissions and how much are you going to reduce your emissions.
Yeah.
And basically emissions equals wealth at the moment. So if you have a lot of emissions, you use a lot of energy and then you have a lot of wealth. So actually everybody agrees, all countries agree that the emissions should be reduced, but they all say, well, he first. So the politicians have been struggling to come to an agreement for 25 years, and they failed to do so. And in the meantime, science became more advanced and learned that the problem is really, 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 really bad. So I think about 10 years ago, you could see in legal doctrine and in magazines and in books that lawyers were starting to think, and scholars were starting to think about if the political system fails to address this problem, and it's a problem which threatens societies and millions, tens, hundreds of millions of people, if we don't do anything about it, isn't there a way that the law can do something, and lawyers can, and judges should step in? And legal doctrine seemed to be a problem. The idea was if you can make a company liable for its emissions, or even a country for emissions, and make them pay compensation and damages, the damages will be so big that they want to avoid those damages, so they will not make these emissions happen. So the fear of being held liable was meant as an incentive to... but then there's the problem of causation. How can I prove that my damage was caused by your emission or your emission? Because all these emissions mix up in the atmosphere. And also, every emission is only a very small part in respect to the global total. So what? So legal doctrine was saying, yeah, it should be...
Iemand moet het nu echt gaan uitdoen. Somebody has to now... We're not looking.
That was a problem, the causation. We cannot prove that.
And that is necessary, right? I mean, if you want to go to court for and ask damages, you have to prove causation.
Yes.
There has to be a direct link
Yes.
between your action
Yes.
and the consequence of that action.
Yes, and most legal systems struggle with mass damages and mass liability. It's always individual, and this is a mass problem. Well, we decided that we would not, we would try a different approach, and it has sometimes been discussed in literature, but very little. We say, well, we're not going to wait until the damage is going to happen. We're going to try to prevent the damage, because if you are liable for the damage your emissions have caused, then you must also be liable for the damage your emissions are going to cause. And legal remedy means not just compensation when the damage is done, but it also means preventing the damage happening. And well, you should use this at the highest possible level because it's a global problem. Well, you cannot hold liable the world community, but we in the Netherlands can hold the Dutch government liable. And that's what we did, and it was the first time ever that it was tried, because there's always the problem, the judge, is he going to make a political decision because it's a political problem? So that's what we tried, and we succeeded. And it made, even the same day, it made headlines all over the world. And well, one of the main arguments we had is, well, yes, it's a global problem, and a global solution, agreed global solution would be preferable. But if you can't reach that, then you have to go for second best, and that means that every country has to assume its own national responsibility.
Yeah.
Well, and because we succeeded, it made headlines, and I've read many books that they say, well, if this will be upheld in appeal, then it might be a major influence all over the world. And I'm very happy to say that after the Urgenda case, there have been 5 cases that all over the world, New Zealand, 2 in America, one very recently in Australia, Germany, that said, well, yes, where judges said, yes, we accept that this is a problem that should best be solved by the politicians. So that's for us an indication to exercise restraint, but not abstinence. Because there is a minimum level of care that governments should observe, and there is a role for the judges. So I think the great victory is that the judges have made a loud and clear signal that they are ready to step in when the rights of citizens are threatened.
So actually, the court, the analysis of the court is they say a government has the duty to protect their citizens from harm.
Yes.
So if you have acknowledged the fact that harm is going to happen, you have the duty to prevent that harm.
Yes.
That is been the way to legally come to a construct where the judge says, okay, Dutch government, now we are demanding from you action.
Yes.
You should reduce carbon pollution 25% in 2020. Okay. So in climate activism, it was historic. Finally, all these activists said, "Woo, we have something in our hands now." But this evening isn't about climate change. This evening is about constitutional reform. In what way does this case for you have importance for the development of constitutional rights?
I think it is an example of the checks and balances, how the political power and the judicial powers of the judge, how they must be in balance, because I think a lot of people agreed that the political system is failing in addressing climate change. Well, then there's the question, okay, we accept this failure, or do we say, well, there can be several reasons why it is failing, but do we have to accept that, or is this a signal for the courts to step in? Well, if you don't protect the rights of citizens, then it's my duty to at least establish the minimum.
Okay.
So it's redefining the role or the balance in this field of climate change, which is huge, and the political impact and the political ramifications are huge. But that did not shrink the court.
No. Mr. Paschier, were you surprised by this case?
I was actually, because the Dutch judiciary is not traditionally not activist at all.
You think this is an activist approach?
In the sense that it touches upon a very controversial political issue, which the political branches, so the legislature and the executive, haven't dealt with yet. So there's no deadlock or something in politics. They just don't address it or don't address it properly. So in that sense, it was a surprise that the judiciary was stepping in already now in this stage already.
Could you, are there rights like the protection against climate change? Is that something we have, is that been arranged or placed somewhere in our body of laws that we have the right to be protected from events like that?
I'm no expert in this field, but of course there is international law that obliges the state to address ecological problems, to protect nature, to protect citizens from harm done. There's also at least one constitutional provision that obliges the state to, care about the environment at least. But these are all legal rights, and law can, especially constitutional law, can set an aspiration, of course. So I was excited too about the Urgenda case.
Why?
But because I agree that climate change is a major problem.
I was expecting a scholarly answer, but you're just also afraid. Yeah, of course.
Yes, I am. Mm-hmm. So I was excited too, but as a scholar, I also know that the ability of law to control political power let alone activate political power, is very limited. So even the most beautiful legal doctrine, the most pointedly, the most detailed doctrine, is only ink on paper if it doesn't have a connection to real-world ideas and real-world power structures.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid that this is the case with with a lot of ecological law and rights, and the doctrine that was developed in the Urgenda case. It's still, at least for the most part, it's still legal. And in order to have an impact in the real world, it really needs to, there needs to be a dynamic between what happens,
In society.
on paper,
Yeah.
what happens in the realm of judiciary, and what happens in politics and society.
Yeah.
Well, I do not agree that you said that they're stepping in already, because the science says the window of opportunity is rapidly closing, and frankly, I don't think we're going to make 2 degrees. I know a climate scientist, he says, is 2 degrees still feasible? Yes, but only in the models. But that means we have to do our best to keep make it 2.1 rather than 2.2. So it was urgent, and I think we were able to convince the judge that it was very urgent. So I don't think he stepped in too early, because Dutch emissions on a per capita basis rank among the highest in the world. If we don't start doing it now, then who will? I agree with you that it's just on paper, and in a way this is, I think, a test for Dutch democracy, and until now I think we have succeeded, because the Dutch government was really not amused about this. No. But they also, because the court said we have to be restrained, we will be restrained, so it's only 25%. And I think the Dutch government said, we don't agree, but we will comply. We're going and appeal, but we will comply.
Yeah, they're appealing not on the substance of the matter, but
Yes. But the effect is that I think, maybe I'm biased, but I think the discussion in the Netherlands on climate change has completely changed. It's now taken seriously, and it was enhanced when 5 months later the Paris Agreement was over it. So, I think the influence already is huge, and the new government has announced that she wants to make a reduction of 49% in 2030. That's even more than we had asked for.
on paper. Yeah.
On paper, that's...
Rijer Paschier, interesting. Informal constitutional change. What does that mean?
It means constitutional change outside formal constitutional amendment procedure. So almost every constitution has a special amendment procedure, which allows institutions to change the text.
In the Netherlands, how do you change the text formally?
According to the procedure set out in Article 137.
And that states... Thank you for not everybody here is a constitutional expert.
There's two rounds in Parliament.
Yeah.
The first round is an ordinary majority, and then the second round after elections is a two-third majority.
In both chambers?
Yes.
Yeah, in the Eerste and the Tweede Kamer. Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's the formal procedure.
That's the formal procedure.
Yeah. And what is the informal procedure?
So the formal procedure is hardly used.
Yeah.
And if it is used, it isn't very... commonly, it's not about very important matters.
No.
In my opinion, the last important formal constitutional amendment to the Dutch constitution was brought about 100 years ago.
Really?
Yeah, when the right to participate in elections was introduced. The universal right to participate in elections.
Yeah.
But then many other changes. The most significant changes in the Netherlands, but in many constitutional democracies around the world, happen through informal processes, at least processes not being the formal amendment procedure, like, for instance, judicial reinterpretations, or through the political process. Practices can change and can be accepted as constitutional, even though,
the official document doesn't reflect that. Yeah. Can you give an example in the case of the Netherlands?
In the Netherlands, the constitution has changed significantly in the process of Europeanization. So our constitution does not codify our membership to the European Union. And the best example is Article 106 of our constitution states that our government regulates the monetary union. So the guilder is still in our constitution.
Yeah.
But
The gulden is and the word democracy is not, but that's fine.
well, the word gulden is not in the
No,
constitution. But, you know, the constitution commands the government to regulate
Yeah.
our coin. But, you know, as you know, since about 15 years,
Yeah.
at least as a digital matter, we have the euro.
Yeah.
And it isn't there. So there's many more examples. For example, it doesn't say that our prime minister is also a member of the European Council, a very important thing, but it isn't there.
Yeah.
So I could go on.
Yeah, it's
For the
great.
whole
I
evening.
mean, it's
Yeah.
great, and I'm always a bit
But
intimidated
perhaps-
by people who are using article numbers, right? In Article 107, you're right. Oh, where is my constitution?
But perhaps the best example is that the words rechtsstaat, so constitutional state, and the
Yeah.
word democracy is also not in our
Yeah.
constitution.
There is kind of a working group going on. I heard
Mhm.
a few years ago talking about this reforming the constitution to get this into the constitution, but it's not happened yet.
It's not that it will happen probably,
Yeah.
but it is not.
There's one thing that I would like to mention, which is important. The Constitution should safeguard the citizens, and especially their fundamental rights, to the normal majority of Parliament. But the Dutch government says explicitly that the laws that Parliament makes, and that's a normal majority, cannot be deemed unconstitutional by the courts.
Yeah.
So our constitution is written, but it has very little legal relevance. We don't suffer much for that because our Supreme Court says that the fundamental rights in the European Declaration of Human Rights has strong legal power and can override our national laws. So the end result is the same, but from a constitutional perspective, it's very strange that our constitution that is meant to safeguard the citizens has no value whatsoever for the courts.
Mr. Bowman, join in.
Thank you. Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, my accent doesn't betray it, but I come from Scotland, and there's a Scots poet.
What happened?
Yeah, I went to school in England and ended up speaking like this. I apologise.
And your parents?
They don't sound like this. But it says, would some power the gift give us to see ourselves as others see us? And I think that having an external perspective, I mean, I'm not Dutch, I'm not involved in Dutch debates.
Bring it on. Yeah.
And so, for example, a lot of the background to this case I was unfamiliar with, but I think there are some things in the Dutch experience which are quite unique when you look at them in their comparative perspective.
Yeah.
And one of the things is the constitutional stability of the Netherlands. Raya said no really fundamental constitutional change for 100 years. But the overall state has probably not had its moment of crisis since 1848, or even
At least not on our territory.
Exactly. And
This territory, the Netherlands
yeah,
proper.
in Netherlands proper.
Hold on,
And so there is this sort of constitutional stability, which most of Europe doesn't share. Around half the constitutions of Europe were written post-1990. Many more were written after the First World War or after the Second World War. So this is an old constitution surrounded by much newer constitutions. And those breakpoints give you an opportunity for fundamental reassessment. So the German constitution that was produced after the Second World War, with very good reason, started... it was an opportunity to start again, an opportunity to correct the mistakes of the past.
Sure.
Likewise, in France, after the Second World War, and then again 12 years afterwards, because they didn't get it right the first time round, they went through this process of constitutional revision from first principles.
Yes.
And the Netherlands, although there was this update in 1983, has never had to have that sort of break point and going back to first principles. Even after the Second World War, the old constitution was just readopted, came back into force after the liberation. So there was never that punctuation of constitutional history, which you see in many other cases.
Which you think is a strength?
Not necessarily.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it can be. It can be, but I actually think in some ways it's a constitution from the era of the steamship and the telegraph.
Oh.
You know, that then gets adjusted over time, reliance on informal mechanisms.
But that
to make
sounds
it
like a
adjusted.
relic of the past. I mean, like useless, but
Not
nice
useless.
to watch.
I mean, it has stood the test of time.
Okay.
So that stands in its favour. But I think these opportunities for fundamental, for example, if you were to write a constitution today for a country like the Netherlands.
Yes. Please do that exercise for me.
And I've got one in my pocket, actually. I'm only half joking. But
I can imagine. You already wrote it already. Yeah.
No. But you wanted to have something like, you wanted to keep the monarchy, for example. But you maybe wanted to tidy up the whole process of government formation. Put some clear constitutional rules in the constitution, not just for the sake of having clear guidance, which is one of the things that constitutions do, but also for signalling the democratic nature of where the government gets its authority from.
Yeah.
So Sweden did that in the 1970s.
Yeah.
No great crisis. They decided that they were going to keep their monarchy, but they wanted to put the rules of government formation in the constitution to make it very clear that the government's authority came from Parliament and ultimately from the people, and not from the crown.
Yeah.
And those are the sorts of things that
Okay,
can be done when you're updating constitutions.
Good. So do that exercise for me. It's now 2017. Climate change is happening. Many crises in the world are happening. What kind of constitution? What are we missing in our current beautiful test of times constitution, which are really relevant, which you would put in a new constitution if you would construct it now or write it now?
I mean, so the process of constitution building is often as important as the result.
Okay.
So the first thing that would happen is that there would have to be some sort of national conversation about that.
Yeah.
And it would be sort of unfeasible to prescribe any outcomes. However, I think there are also, in parallel to that, changes in constitutional technology that happen over time. So the government formation mechanism is one that I think there would be strong grounds for tidying that up. I think this question of Article 120 and the prohibition on that's the prohibition of judicial review of the constitutionality of legislation.
Yeah.
That is the sort of issue which, if you were starting from scratch, maybe you wouldn't want to do that now. It made sense at the time. At the time that the Constitution was originally written, this was about protecting the legislature from the king's judges.
Yes.
And actually protecting popular power as represented in Parliament against the state. Yeah. Now we wouldn't see it in that way.
Against the aristocratic judiciary, the elite judiciary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And other countries have made that change. So Belgium made that change, and Luxembourg made that change.
Many, right? I mean, constitutional review of laws is quite a common practice now in a lot of
the Netherlands is now the outlier.
Yeah.
But it wasn't when the Constitution was written. That's the point.
But the Netherlands is the outlier.
Now,
if you look at the Constitution, so Article 120 is unique, the provision to review legislation against the Constitution. But we do something else, which makes the issue of Article 120 not that relevant. We do something very progressive, and that is the Dutch judiciary, as one of the only in the world, is allowed to review legislation against international law, which also allowed for the Urgenda case. Without this, this power of the judiciary, the Urgenda case wasn't possible. So
true.
Well, it's about the technique of the court. True is that the Dutch legal system is very open to international influences.
Yes. Yeah. So you can actually say you can go to court and argue that a certain law is not in line with an article in a European Human Rights Treaty, and then you can ask the courts to overrule that decision.
And the judiciary does it all the time,
especially
in the field of fundamental rights.
Yeah.
So
that was already mentioned by you. I mean, you say, okay, this constitution of the Netherlands, okay, you cannot review it, but whatever, you have the international treaties which you can use to review the laws of the country, and it's in practice.
Yes, but there was an initiative by Taverne from the VVD who wanted to change the law and prohibit the judiciary to use the international laws. So that was...
But it hadn't...
It was only an initiative.
Yeah.
Well, it's still not withdrawn, but I think they have been suffocating it slowly.
Yeah,
It's extremely unlikely that that
at the moment
will
it is,
succeed.
yes.
There's not even support from his own party, I think.
No,
but okay.
not anymore.
Anyway, so what do you miss in our body? You say we have all these informal ways of changing the constitutional rights, although it's not in the letter of our constitution, right? In the text of the constitution. And you gave all these European examples, and you invited me to listen to you for 2 hours to explain that. And well, actually, I would love to know that everything about it. But the idea is, if you look at our body of constitutional rights, formal and informal, do you think we are lacking things which are really important to put in?
We are lacking a lot of things because our government, as many other governments in the world, are not addressing global problems. So our problem, I think, our problem isn't primarily legal.
Yeah.
Our problem is more in the realm of power, of politics, and that is the nation state. So the nation state isn't capable of addressing the problems we have. What we lack, I think, is a world state, actually. And strong international institutions. Is it so shocking?
No. Well, it's nice to hear because I wasn't expecting the answer. So you say it's fine to talk about what we're missing in our nation states system, but actually that is not the real debate. If you really want to protect citizens from global challenges, you need to go beyond the level of the nation
and
state.
we have international law. And we have quite ambitious international law and international aspirations, like the Paris Treaty, for example. I don't know whether it's ambitious enough, but at least it's something.
Well below 2 degrees.
But
is really
so
ambitious.
legally, there isn't that much of a problem. The problem is that all these ambitions and aspirational laws, which look very nice on paper, lack a dynamic with strong institutions.
Yeah. So actually, it's interesting from a person who's looking at constitutional rights. He says, let's shift our focus from the nation state to a higher level, even a global level, and where we should build constitutions which actually can solve the problems we face today.
And don't expect too much from law.
Yeah.
Can I just come in on that point? Because I think it's tempting to see constitutional rights simply in terms of like a Bill of Rights or fundamental rights or essentially protections or guarantees for the individual against the state. But I would argue that in many cases that the really key constitutional rights are actually democratic rights. So they're rights of political participation and rights to hold governments to account and to throw governments out of office, which is something that I understand is quite difficult here. And even rights of direct democracy. So, for example, in Latvia, the constitution contains a number of very interesting provisions. One is a citizens' initiative provision that enables a fairly small number of citizens actually to gather a petition to hold then a binding referendum on an issue. And there are problems with that in terms of sort of how do you protect minorities and other issues. But in terms of just the ability of the constitution to manifest and apply the will of the people. It's very, very powerful. They also have a provision whereby they can hold a referendum on the dissolution of parliament.
Yeah.
Which they did a few years ago. And the people get to vote, do we want to have new elections now? And those kinds of constitutional rights, I think...
are much more important.
Well, so they constitute the state politically. And they provide the political mechanisms within which people can then contest for particular outcomes.
Yeah.
So rather than looking at the Constitution simply as a guarantee of outcomes, say you have the right to X, Y, and Z, you look at it as guaranteeing people's ability to contest for those outcomes.
Yeah, you guarantee the process.
Exactly.
Instead of the outcome.
Yeah.
And if you then look at Western democracies, I mean, Latvia is of course a very interesting example. Also, I think Iceland.
Yes, Iceland is a good one for that.
For that as well. What can we learn from? What should we? I mean, we're now focusing on the Dutch situation because, well, this is the Dutch evening of the IDEA report. What can we learn from experiences like that can aspire us to change?
So I think one of the first things to say is that direct democracy comes in lots of different shapes and sizes. And just because you've tried one thing and maybe it didn't work out as people expected doesn't mean that direct democracy in itself is a bad idea. There are various ways in which it can be applied. And I think that sometimes it can be applied in ways that can be seen as crudely majoritarian, but it need not necessarily be. I mean, our Danish colleague can correct me if I'm wrong, but Denmark has a provision in its constitution which enables appeal to a referendum if 1/3 of the members of parliament so demand.
He's nodding, yeah.
And it's very rarely been used, but the effect of it is actually to produce consensus.
Yeah, that would really help in the Brexit debate, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, don't get me started, please.
Oh, sorry.
But yeah, well, okay, so this is an interesting point about the effect of constitutions.
Yes.
I think if we'd had a written constitution in the UK, then I wouldn't say that the Brexit referendum wouldn't have happened, but it would have happened within a constitutional context where its result in terms of the consequences of the vote would have been perhaps more predictable.
Yeah. That's one example,
That's
right?
one example
really good idea,
of where we just, because we don't have the meta rules that establish the structure of the state and the rules by which power is exercised, a government, for political reasons, on the basis of its own calculation, could decide to hold a referendum on a major issue of fundamental constitutional significance and then decide what to do with the outcome. And Britain is a very extreme case that's not very useful in comparative analysis because we don't have...
You're the outlier.
We're the outlier of the outliers, exactly. Yeah. But it just shows how the Constitution is important for regulating the political game.
Yes, please.
Hello. Sorry, I'm Jan Schrijver. Sorry to step in, but you were talking about the need for a constitution of a higher level, world government or so. But still, it remains government. Also, our constitution is mainly concerning the relationship between citizens and government. I wonder if we are talking about the Urgenda case, so why not rights that ruling relationship between people and companies? Or I would like to be protected from Google and Facebook powers, like, for instance, or whatever. But the relationship between citizens and companies have to be regulated.
If we want to protect people, if that is one of the notions of basic rights, even whether it's about, talking about processes or outcomes, and the powers that be are not the state sometimes, in some cases, and challenges we face. He wants to broaden the debate about constitutional rights, and to which you can relate to.
I very much agree with what you are saying.
Okay.
At least half of our society is private, and the private sector in a globalized world is extremely powerful. Whereas these huge companies, especially the 5 companies in Silicon Valley, are privately owned, but have a huge impact on society. Some scholars compare the situation we have now with the situation we had in the 18th century, where states were privately owned by kings and aristocrats, but had an increasingly great effect on society. And the response to that was the constitutionalization of the state. And some people now argue that our response to these multinational companies should be the constitutionalization, or at least partly, of these great powers.
Well, I think there are many forms of power in society: economic power, military power, social stratification. And the wonderful thing is that we have developed the government as the power that rules them all, the ring that rules them all. So it's the power of the government, and we have organized it in a way that everybody can participate in the exercise of the power and the forming of the power. That's the democratic ideal, one power to rule them all, and everybody can participate. And one of the challenges we are facing, in my opinion, is that we have allowed, and it's a political agenda, that the national state should withdraw, and because it must be the companies, it must be private, it must be citizen society. And what we effectively are doing is loosening the grip of the institution that we made and we all could participate in, and we are releasing the powers of the private companies. And what I also think is very dangerous is the power that big companies are getting in influencing and manipulating the information that we receive, because the information we receive forms our opinions, and the presumption of democracy is that we have a free will and that we are reasoning. And well, that's one of the things that worries me: the retreat of the government.
Is then the logical next step or answer to your analysis that we should regain or we take that power back to the nation state?
Yes.
Or, as you say, create a new movement of constitutionalizing private sector relationship?
I don't think we can restore the nation state.
No.
And if we could, we shouldn't do it, because that would mean poverty.
Poverty? How do you mean?
Okay, explain.
Because these big companies generate a lot of wealth and prosperity.
No,
they make iPhones possible
but
and all kind of things citizens like and want to have. If we would...
But sorry, I'm to interrupt you, but the UK and the United States are the nations that have the smallest governments, the most anti-government culture. And the inequality in those states is far bigger than it is in Europe, where the Rhineland model. So maybe you would disagree or agree, but...
No, I agree. I would say Scotland has a slightly different tradition of thinking about it, which is influenced by other modes of thought that are perhaps more critical. Part of its civil law tradition, its Calvinist tradition, it's kind of closer to the Netherlands in some ways, but it has never been able to give effect to that because it doesn't have a state of its own. But I'm intrigued by this. You know, I do agree that the democratic nation state is probably the thing that has best made life livable for ordinary working people in the 20th century, and that the destruction of that state was in part a political choice designed to weaken those protections. But I don't know. I mean, I would be concerned about the democratic legitimacy and democratic efficiency of a world state. I sometimes toy with ideas of, well, do we need to go the other way? Do we need to go back to city-states and region states? And
Parliament of the mayors, like Benjamin Barber.
Exactly. And that might involve reversing some of our assumptions about globalization and trade, and maybe because when you look at sort of medieval city-states, they were fiercely protectionist, and they did that to preserve their own economy. And I'm not an economist, and I'm not a historian, and I don't know enough about it, but I would like to see a really well-informed debate about the nation state versus the city state versus the...
Well, Benjamin Barber was in our program, one of these 25, unfortunately he passed away, but he was in our series. Benjamin Barber, yeah.
He died,
and
that's unfortunate.
And he talked about...
It's news to me.
He talked about his initiative, because he says exactly what you're saying. If you look, the nation state is failing in effectively solving, for instance, climate change. We needed to go to another system because the problems are at the level of the city-state, and the solutions are as well.
So I think the local level is very important too. I think the local level is important and the global level is important, but that cuts out the nation state. The nation state is, cannot address the local problems and cannot address the global problems.
Well, we'll talk about that.
Yeah,
in
interesting.
Another time.
What is important? Well, but the city state is not the only answer, because in medieval times there wasn't something that there is now. That's technological change, which forces us to think globally because it generates global problems.
For some problems, yes. For other problems, we can local. So I'm not choosing for one level.
Yes.
Me neither.
No.
Well, that's good. I mean, we stopped this debate of round one with a question. We don't know. I really like that when scholars say, no, I don't know, because that means you have a lot of work to do in your research. This is the end of round one. Thank you so much for your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's go to the second round. And let me introduce the panel. All my notes, which I didn't use, thank you. Yeah, three people at the table. The first is a very famous journalist in the Netherlands. Actually, she writes, among others, for the Groene Amsterdammer, about growing inequality, populism, but she's also really into religion a few years now. She wrote a book, Polderen 3.0, Poldering? Is that the Dutch word? Yeah. The English pronunciation. Exploring new forms to engage with and govern the common good. She was in the board of ProDemos, but she was also one of the leading editors at the Volkskrant. It's fantastic that she is part of my panel as the only female panelist. And next to me, of course, Yvonne Sommerhoff. Please, can I introduce you? Come to the stage. The second person I already introduced a little bit because I said, well, you were supposed to be in the first introductory talk, but it was late. Siewert van der Linden, he's an activist, columnist, former chairman of an activist movement for scholieren, pupils?
School students, yes.
School students. But he's not here because of that, but because he was the initiator of a very interesting initiative, political youth movement, the G500s, and I will give you the opportunity to introduce that, what the idea was of that initiative. Welcome.
Thank
You're
you.
a very famous commentator on Dutch television on political affairs. And the last person in this panel is actually a politician. He's a member of parliament for D66, and before that he was the director of the Hans van Mierlo Foundation, the scientific office of the Liberal Democratic Party, D66. Welcome.
Thank you.
Yes. Do you want to comment on what was happening in the first round? Did you have all kinds of ideas now, or do you think?
Yes, I think I had about 5 ideas. Shall I mention one?
Yeah,
yes.
mention one.
Well, I was intrigued by what Raya said about the nation state becoming unimportant,
yeah.
obsolete. And I just said, well, just imagine that we would skip the AOA, our pension system, and see what happens, and then see how oblivious our state is. We take so many things from our state for granted, which is so very important. I think we think too easily about the unimportance of the state. I think many people, many citizens in the Netherlands, they trust on the state, they depend on the state, they depend on all the provisions the state takes care, and I should not take that as easy as you seem to do.
Good. We're going to talk about that because we invited you because you really study the impact of social inequality to the functioning of democracy. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Siewert, I said I would give you the opportunity for the international crowd here. What was the G500?
Yeah, let me introduce it to you all. Back in 2012, we had the feeling that formal participation in political parties was on the decline, and one of the main things was actually that we saw that all the power lies with the three main political parties of the Netherlands. Always 2 of the 3 are in government. And the second thought was that if you go to party congresses, you don't see a lot of youngsters up there. And when we looked into the statistics, we saw that, for instance, the Christian Democrats, the average party member is around 68 years old.
Not.
Yeah, and Social Democrats, it was like 59, and for the Liberals, it was, I thought they were among the youngest with 55 or something. And we had the feeling back then, well, young people are not participating. There are some common agenda points that we would like to introduce to all parties. So if not enough people will become member of a party, let's put on a trick and let's become member of all parties at the same time. And let's do it with 500 people, because most party congresses are around 1,000 people. So then we have 1/3 of the votes, and it's still democratic, so we need to convince other party members, but we will bring in young people to political parties. And back then it worked pretty well. It was kind of political hacking, and there was a coalition agreement where we put in a lot of things. And at the same time, which was really a pity, after the elections, a lot of young people didn't feel really at home in the political parties, so it just fell apart. So we found a mechanism to bring young people to political parties and bring some change. But at the same time, it was not the most durable initiative ever. So it's not like we should put it in the constitution. But what was really fascinating to me is that there is just a complete lack of difference between political parties.
Yeah.
So when you just go to the three main ideologies,
Christian Democrats, Labour,
and Liberals, you could convince them all three of the same agenda points.
With the same arguments.
Yeah, and that really made me thinking.
So this round is about the checks and balances and about participation, right?
Yeah.
And one of the notions of this report is that, the electoral participation is declining, and specific groups are actually really, are not going to the ballot box anymore. That is, it's a social issue. I mean, because people with a lower income, it's people with a migrant background, and it's young people. That seems to, I mean, should worry us, I think, if we talk about resilient democracy, right? Is there what do you think? Should we be worried about the democracy and that aspect of democracy in the Netherlands?
Well, I think so. I wrote about it a few years ago, because I wrote this article in the Groene Amsterdammer saying that the biggest party in the Netherlands was the party of the non-voters, which was the point at the time. And I would call several people from the political system to ask that for comment, and they would all say, "Oh, well, we know that now for years, don't we? There's nothing new. Why would you write about it? We've been knowing this for such a long time. It happens all over the place. Why should we worry?" And and only when David van Rijbroek came with this book against elections, right, and actually addressing this problem that 1/4 of the people is not actually participating, and he made these ideas, these very interesting ideas about, some kind of loting. What's the English word for loting?
Lottery.
A lottery. Then even many people would still in the Netherlands react like, "Oh well, this is a crazy idea." So to me, it seemed quite clear at the time that many people did not really think it was very important that every person would have the same access to the political outcome, because otherwise they would try their best to actually engage these people. And I know I spoke to political scientists who implied that the political system was not really interested in trying to get these people on board, because they would obviously not vote for them. So so I think that, I mean, by now you see, of course, new movements, new people, enthusiasts by the political system, but I think that's also because parties, like you say, that didn't really change did not have big changes in between them.
Is Thierry Baudet very popular among youngsters?
Well, he's not. I don't think he's very popular at the moment, but of course, yes, he is interesting to a certain amount of youngsters.
Yeah.
Also because, and that's I think pretty interesting, the whole idea of cartel politics.
Yeah.
He made it popular in the Netherlands, and I think it resonates with a lot of young people who think they lack influence on the outcome of political process. So I'm not so worried about turnout, but for instance around the referendums, about coalition forming, I think that really appeals to a lot of young, higher educated, conservative voters. Yes.
So are you worried about this phenomenon which has been described in the report about the state of this democracy?
Well, against the backdrop of what the professor said, that we are doing relatively well in the Netherlands, I think we should be concerned about the slipping,
declining,
the backslide, but also trying to improve those last 20%, so to speak, for the Dutch participation. And actually, I completely agree with you that I think parties are underestimating the effect of the disenfranchisement of people in socially economically disadvantaged neighborhoods, and that there should be much more attention for this. I mean, we're doing relatively well as a party reaching out to youngsters, but if I was a local politician in The Hague, and if you look at the electoral map of The Hague, it's very concerning.
Yeah, because certain neighborhoods are just not participating at all anymore.
Yeah, and we're not even concerned about it anymore.
I
A
know,
couple of
that's
weeks,
the point,
2 weeks ago, there were redistricting municipal elections in the north of the Netherlands, and turnout in all of them was 40%.
Yeah.
And there was no news item about this. And also for those neighborhoods in The Hague, turnout with municipal elections has been under 50% for the past decade. And we have come to accept it.
Okay, so now we all are worried. Okay, so
I'm not
we've
worried.
No. Well, you said there were 3 parties which.
Yeah, I'm not worried actually about voter turnout. I think it's still relatively high. But if you look at the numbers, I think you should be really worried about the formal participation into party politics.
Yes.
If you see the party membership is declining, but also the people that are having interaction with political parties.
Yes.
So we now come to a point where we have more political jobs in the Netherlands than we have active people.
Yes.
Within the 5 big parties.
Yes.
So it means that
if all the mayors and aldermen and all the council members,
if you just add them up, and that means that you don't have a choice within parties who will fulfill the jobs, and that
there's
is
no
really
competition.
lacking democratic mechanisms in that. And I think that is actually the most worrying thing right now.
Interesting. Okay,
well,
so you share a worry about, and now we're going to talk about the solutions, right? So what kind of things, mechanisms, or ideas should we develop to change this?
Well, I think from old times, the Netherlands, I mean, I'm very happy we are a resilient democracy, but I think in the Netherlands, more than in many other countries, we've always been a society where lots of government things have been actually addressed by other organizations than the government. So we had, for instance, housing, care, education have all come from our pillar system, from religious backgrounds.
There were citizen initiatives, I think.
There were
right?
citizens, exactly, and they were governed by religion idea or by political affiliation. So, and only the government only adopted it much later. So I think that for many people, the government is not just Parliament or The Hague or the ministry, but also whether they can go to a good hospital or whether they have a good doctor or they're good schools. Or so I think that addressing democracy is also very much about addressing these institutions. And we were discussing already, the decline of the state in the last 20 years, and the former panel people called it a political decision. But I think that many people have, just in the country, have experienced that, for instance, local institutions for housing care would not take care of their houses anymore, or would just try to become very competitive in European ways, or so that they felt left out. Yes, they felt left out by their own institutions. So I always say, let's not forget that democracy is not just about voting. In that case, I agree with you, or with Parliament. I mean, if you look at Parliament, I'm at your job now, I'm afraid, but I mean, it's a lot about speaking. I mean, it's really
What's in the
parliaments.
word, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So, I mean, the things that are done are actually often done by other organizations. And I always say we must take into account also these institutions and count them within our democracy.
Yes. And those institutions are lacking democratic procedures, right? I mean,
And
they are
lacking-
not, you cannot have access to them or to
No.
govern them.
Exactly. You can, and even some of them are really in danger now, because actually the only organizations they are accountable to are, for instance, the Autoriteit Consumentenmarkten or
Non-democratic authorities.
non-democratic authorities who actually rely on the Lisbon agenda from the European Union 20 years ago and who only provide for competition. So, I mean, very important services in our country are not really debated in this political way. They are debated just only in an economic way, and we just leave it like that. And I think this is a problem of our democracy that nobody really seems to be able to address.
Yeah. So if we talk about democratization or the re-democratization of society, you say let's not only focus on all these representative bodies. Let's talk about the organizations which really influence or impact the quality of life of the ordinary citizen, and that are housing, care, schooling, and institutions like that should be democratic.
Exactly. Because now you see, for instance, Parliament speaks about the salary of these people, or I mean, they speak about these things, but not about what's really happening, because that is it's their responsibility and not the responsibility of politics.
Okay, if you would have to propose as well. How do you say that, as a solution to the problem of lacking democracy or worrying, the worries we just mentioned, what suggestion would you have?
Well, first of all, I don't think there's a fix-all kind of solution, and I think this is a very
no silver bullets.
No. But democracy and societal organizations organizing medezeggenschap in a better way is
well,
certainly
governing or co-governing would be better, right?
Yeah, and holding them accountable by the people that benefit or don't benefit from their services or that have a real stake in it, whether it's schools or whether it's hospitals. I think that's an important part, but I think also those kind of rules are made by politics.
Okay.
So Parliament should legislate so those kind of checks and balances within those systems are better shaped. The other point that you made, I think for the past 25 years, if you look at all parties combined, the landscape has been relatively stable. It's low, but it's stable. But within the political party membership landscape, there's been a lot of changes, like the Animal Welfare Party and D66 have doubled, whereas the Christian Democrats and the Labour Party have significantly decreased. So if you add up the major five, it may be a little bit misrepresenting how political positions are assigned in the Netherlands, especially with local elections. The local parties are the largest party every time.
Yeah, but he really checked all the members of all parties?
Yes, of the five biggest.
No, not of the five biggest. Oh, you're the five. Oh, then, yeah.
And the local parties are the biggest, and they are the major office holder. But I mean, Siewert does have a point that this is disconcerting. So I think there is a burden upon political parties themselves to reach out more and also try to engage with the electorate more.
Is that enough if you only have 1.9% of the people actually?
No. I mean, everyone should become a member of this political party. This lady already did.
Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Simone Filippini. I'm the director of the Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy. I would like to table a slightly different issue that basically already came to the fore in the previous discussion, and that's about new technology, potentially beneficial for democracy or enhancing democratic participation, but also potentially very damaging. For example, we saw in the Netherlands at the previous, the latest elections, that some parties tried to, and did in practice, distributed malinformation.
Fake news.
Well, even worse than fake news, maybe, probably, or we're using trolling. Last week, together, by the way, with International IDEA, we organized a conference on innovating democracy, So we're all very busy with this subject.
Yes.
And we had, for example, the guy who did the entire digital campaign, including the fundraising part of it for Trump campaign. Yeah. That was a piece of perfection. Perfected, reach out to the voters and getting them all with, with the right information. The issue, and I'll come to my question, or my point, but I need a little bit of introduction there. The thing is that, for example, in the US, which is not yet the case here, but you can get voter files, you can buy them, you can buy consumer files, and they are really targeting the voters like in a more perfected manner every single election. The consumers by the corporates are also targeted in ever more perfect way. And there is also a link between voter behavior and buying behavior. What I want to say is that voters are being funneled into getting only the information, also through Facebook and the other socials, that the systems, the algorithms, develop for them. So, and the same thing happens on the other side. So people don't meet each other in the middle anymore. And what in the democratic, what is in my perspective very a big democratic issue, is that you take the freedom and space away from voters to be informed from different sides and to develop their own opinions on different issues. Because they're funneled so much into a certain direction by the perfection of technology. So I would like to really hear your perspective on this.
It's a nice conversation,
yeah.
But I'm not really worried about the things you are talking about. I want to address another issue, and that is the impact of the dynamics of these 5 major corporates on the actually mind or the
Well, I'm asking a question now, and you can take that with you, of course. But I think it's more or less connected.
Yeah, I understand.
Huh?
Thanks. You can stay there, because maybe they want to...
Well, on the one hand, I think we should get out of our physical bubble more as well. When I was director of the think tank of the Dutch Liberal Democratic Party, we developed this serious game actually to go into those neighborhoods where people are not voting enough, I think. So you should also meet them face to face. But I completely agree with you. I think that the algorithm should be auditable by and should be much more transparent.
Open.
Yeah, and I mean, you raised the point about fiscal transparency, so to speak, and where does the funding go? As a political party, we have to declare income above 4,500 donations, but how we spend the money in campaigns can be completely off all the books, and also the soft money coming in from other channels is completely off limits. So a lot of the news stories are not just news stories, but are actually ads that are not being declared who bought them.
But even then, how to counter this issue, because it's a really serious and complex issue.
Well, you say it's a serious issue. I actually disagree with it. I do think it's the hype of the year. Recently, there has been done some research by Stanford and Harvard into the 2016 elections, and it was the first empirical analysis of the impact of fake news on the election outcomes. And what they found is actually that the amount of people that think they are influenced by fake news is much higher than in reality.
Yeah.
It's like 10-fold higher than the people that actually receive these messages. Second is the amount of messages is much lower. And third is one ad is actually has more influence than one fake news post on Facebook. So, and there's a second thing, I think really why it is so interesting for a lot of people to believe that fake news is really meddling in our democratic process is because it opens up the possibility that the election of Trump, Brexit, was just a mistake and happened because of fake news. And if you just look into the numbers, it was just, that's completely untrue. And I think that is really... Okay.
Well, several things. Well, I do agree that fake news may not be the biggest problem. But I do agree on your. I mean, I'm also very, very worried about the power of the Big Five, and I think this is something that we all need to address and to think about. And I think that's a very serious problem.
Yes.
But we must not forget that up until about 50 years ago, nobody came out of this bubble. You were either Catholic or Protestant or Social Democrat or
You didn't
or
sleep on the
liberal,
same pillow.
and you were on the
No.
same school, and you were just like that. Only at that time, and that was normal in the Netherlands. And we had a very good democracy, a constitution for 150 years, and all very happy. And but there were still people meeting each other. So even living in a bubble does not mean that we have a problem. So, but the problem is, of course, if other people influence your information so much. But I want to make a solution, an idea for a solution, because I don't think that we will be able to stop Facebook ourselves or say to Mr. Bezos, well, you stop with your Amazon. Well, you can, of course, try not to use Alexa, or you can try not to, and then I think these things will all starting to happen more. People will start to actually answer by their consumer behavior, but I think it will take a long time for them to listen. But I think that perhaps one way of actually addressing this for ourselves in the Netherlands might be, I mean, Eliot said that we have been having this constitution for 150 years. It's a bit an old-fashioned constitution. Still, we saw that, for instance, Sylvana Simons, she actually made a claim to our constitution by saying Article 1, by saying the first article of our constitution wanting to be, because that's the article saying that all people should be treated in the same way, all people are equal for law. And I would think that it would be a very good idea in the Netherlands if we would try to have all sorts of projects and conversations and actually engaging all people living in the Netherlands in the deepest ideas of our constitution, so that we feel that this is what we are carrying all together.
A truly participatory process. I mean,
Exactly,
really
exactly.
a talk with everybody.
Exactly, because I think our democracy actually rests on our constitution, and if we feel that we all are necessary in keeping up freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of of being able to have unions and all these other freedoms, then perhaps we will be stronger in
resilient ourselves.
Exactly.
Actually,
Exactly, that's the word.
to counter the power of these big five.
Yeah, to be honest, I think it's a myth to think that by strengthening constitution in one way or another, or getting people more aware of it, that you can hold back, say, the huge influence of digital tools.
What is the solution in your
Well,
opinion?
we are looking for solutions. So we are going to engage in further discussions to really find solutions. And maybe, Siewert, answering or, well, going into what you said about fake news, we had a really great guy there last week, Mike Hind, and he said fake news is so 2016.
Yeah.
We are now talking about astroturfing, and
Yes.
that is the large-scale
Yeah.
manipulation of people's
It's
people's
fake
opinions
organization, fake
through
civil.
all kinds of means, so that
It's-
as a person you come across that type of information through all kinds of different channels. So you feel that it must be true,
Yeah.
which is even more dangerous.
Okay, astroturfing. I really like that word. I mean, we
I
should
love
make it a
it.
word because it's like fake
But it's
grass,
really
and it
scary.
reminds you of grassroots organizations, but then fake grassroots organizations. So that's why astroturfing is called like astroturfing. So it's creating fake civil society organizations to support a cause.
But how would you stop that? What will you do?
Or being aware of it.
And how do you become aware of it? I mean, what is your solution?
Well, there are no easy solutions. Somebody said
No, I
before,
mean,
there
you
are no
say
easy solutions.
my solution is not a good solution. But
No.
what's your solution?
No, but I was asking you as representatives here on this panel
Yeah,
to whether you have put some thought to this. Well, I think that we have to think about different types of resilience of voters. And, there is now in the cabinet talk of making children more resilient to assess for themselves what type of information is a more
Media
long-term
literacy.
solution.
Yeah,
But
because exactly.
there are also technical solutions maybe to this. We will
Okay.
also go into those. Yeah.
Thanks. No, it's not to
No,
stop this
I
part of the
understand it.
conversation.
But she asked me, so I don't even
great,
want
great,
to
great,
answer.
great. Thanks for your contribution. Because thank you. We were but I want to go back to the idea of, you said, I think political parties should really step up, right? I mean, we should really go into the streets, be much more
Well,
aware of
yeah.
is popular into the streets.
Well, yeah.
Sorry. We should really think about being really movements which engage with citizens and become really big civilian organization, right?
Well, I don't think we.
No, do you have to answer?
I don't think we can become mass organizations like we were in the past as political parties. I think also there's a couple of trends that have influenced why participation in political parties has decreased, and it's the same reasons you mentioned why depillarization in the Netherlands has also led to less church attendance, less membership of labor unions, all those kind of things, and that you see it as an international trend. So I think political parties should also adapt in their structures and the ways they work.
So membership
to
isn't the holy
tune in.
grail.
No, like exploring more associate membership, those kind of things.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry to
So
going
you were
again,
like,
double digging.
you were like, everybody's like, what is he doing? But it likes like you've seen the light.
Well, no, it was just a very quick sort. I was going to make the point actually that Yus has just made, which is about
You can sit down again.
About how political parties used to represent real social movements and real sections of society.
Yeah.
And so, in representing parties in parliament, particularly in a system like the Netherlands, you were actually representing the structure of society in the decision making. And what is the structure of society today? Who are the social groups? What are the joins that hold people together that parties can represent? And it feels to me as if we've created a very polarized but also a very atomized society, precisely because of things like the decline of trade unions and the decline of churches. And what is there to fill that void that holds people together? I'm going to sit right down.
Thank you.
Well, I think it's a question of reversing cause and effect, the way you present it. But I think you see a fragmentation in Dutch politics that reflects the fragmentation in Dutch society. And you have this animal welfare party, you have the senior party, you have DENK, that all appeal to their specific constituencies. By not presenting a sort of general interest story, but by presenting a special interest story.
Yeah. Can you respond?
Yeah, what I believe is that one of the main things we need to do is actually make inroads for civic groups to participate in politics, because you can't do it internally in party politics, so we have to put pressure from the outside in on the system. So that means that, for instance, I would love that you had the opportunity to speak in parliament and not to a judge. That we can have constitutional reviews. It should be just nothing more than normal that all groups can go to a judge. Referenda, and especially consultative referenda. And I think it will bring a different democratic spirit to our politicians, because at that time we now have special interest group in our parliament. I would really love to have a broad base of Democrats pushing on the political systems, and that the people inside the political system have to defend the common good, so that they have to speak against all these persons that are coming into parliament with all their special interests, and that they have to paint a broader picture. And I think 50 years ago you would do that within a political party. Well, the political party system is dead, so now we have to make a new system where we do it within a new democratic institution, new parliament, stuff like that.
A new process.
A new process, so that we make inroads for all kind of civil activities in our democracy.
Like the right to speak.
Right to speak.
The right exists, huh? There is a citizens' initiative.
But the problem is that 1 year the parliament cannot speak about it for 1 year, and then you can address the issue. So, for instance, wind energy, which is problematic, we cannot address that in the parliament because you've already talked about it in some commission, for instance. a few months ago. So that is a bit of a problematic aspect.
For that specific
But in
instrument.
some
But there's a
way-
lot of hearings
I know,
with
I know.
civil society groups, of course. But
Of course.
In some ways, we are already doing what Siewert is saying, because I don't know if one of you read the article in the Financiële Dagblad from last Saturday, but there are so many agreements now.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
we are
Social dialogue.
so many agreements where all these groups are actually participating.
But without democratic control.
Yeah.
For instance, our whole energieakkoord.
Yes,
Energy
all these
accord.
kinds
So
of yes,
it's done
yes.
not
It's
in
done.
via parliament, but it's done
Yeah.
via the socio-economic council,
Yes,
which
yes.
is not a democratic institution.
Yes, let's hear
Well-
from the people.
Yes. I would prefer to do it in Dutch, but
It's okay. Do it in
Ja?
Dutch.
oké. Ik ben het eens met wat Siebren
Siebert,
zei
ja.
over. En het gaat er niet alleen om het proces, maar ook een nieuwe vorm van parlement. D66 en de politieke partijen die zouden inderdaad meer de straat op moeten. Maar de mensen van de straat, en ik leg dat de woorden van Siebren en ook van Yvonne zo uit, die moeten in het parlement. En niet alleen met spreekrecht.
No, but
Maar-
with membership.
Membership. Ik heb een conceptmanifest geschreven.
Ja.
En de kern daarvan is dus dat er een gemengde democratie zou moeten komen van zowel politieke partijen als direct gekozen burgers.
So
Ja?
let me, for the international guests, translate your comment. You say, I don't want to right to speak in parliament. I want to be actually a member of parliament, regardless of that I'm not part of a political party. So I think there should be a mix. He thinks that there should be a mixed system of political party representing people in the parliament and directly elected civilians, citizens. I think that is interesting because 2 days ago, Joost Luijendijk made an interesting speech in The Hague, and he made a nice, because I'm a woman, I think it was nice, because he said, okay, if you would ask the Dutch society and you put them all in one place, if that would be possible, 70 million, you would ask, can all women sit down? Because, of course, Rutte tried to find you as a talented person for a cabinet, but he just couldn't. So sit down. And then you would say, all people from a minority background, sit down, because we don't want you. And then all the people who are not living in the cities, can you sit down? And then if you're not from a middle class background, sit down. If you're not highly educated, sit down. And then only 4% of the Dutch society would be standing, male, all these things. And he said, that's
And you're
interesting.
looking at me.
No, I'm looking at you. Yeah, that's why, of course, it's nice for me to say. And then he said that's problematic because the 4% of these people are represented in the parliament for 90 or for 60%, or I think 60% now. So he says in all the official institutions, this little group of 4% is represented in a majority in all these institutions.
You know, if there is...
You disagree?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the criteria are a little bit too exclusionary, I think. But your point is well taken.
Well, you know what is the problem with politics in the Netherlands? It's like a winner-takes-all system, but for a very small group.
Exactly.
So when you have power, you will get more power, and there's not a lot of countervailing power for minorities, but also for just ordinary citizens. So we need to find processes where we can bring in countervailing power. Constitutional reviews are one, but also, for instance, what is to me really mind-boggling is you go to the voting booth, vote on a political party, and then just all the magic happens with the making of coalitions. And it's really strange to me that we can't have a second vote where we can explain our vote. So the meaning behind our vote. Why did we vote for a certain party? Do we want to make coalition A or B, or is there a certain issue that was really important for you? So I think we should bring more options on the menu, and then for politicians in power, they should really acknowledge that sometimes you just can't win. Although all the lights are green in the system, you really need to think about other people as well and take your loss sometimes, because I think that makes really a lot of people angry right now in the Netherlands. Is that politicians don't take their loss. If there is a referendum, just do something different. if you all came to the voting booth and you lost a lot of seats, you just go into government. Sometimes you need to have restrictions on yourself, and if politicians can't do it, we need to make processes to make it happen.
But see, don't you think that it's actually quite easy in our country to have all kinds of action? I mean, just
Action,
look at and also influence. Look now
Influence,
at this.
but power, no.
No,
At
but
least
just for instance, the teachers who are now actually defying the union and making this, and actually everyone is listening to them. So I have a look at your own G500. I mean, just 500 young guys, and look what they did. So I mean, I often get the idea that it's not that difficult in the Netherlands to make a social statement and to get attention.
But in the long run, you will always lose.
But some would say that the people who are actually successful in that are still in the group Joris described as the 4% of the Netherlands. That's so even, for instance, the protest parties like Wilders was already in the system, and then you can divide the system and create a protest party, for instance.
Well,
so you need
but
to be
how come we cannot energize other people to become more?
How is it possible that for just like 10 years on issues like Europe, immigration, what we do with lower educated people, social welfare, that there is like 70 or 80% of the people are on point A, politicians are on point B, and for 10 to 15 years, the people will lose out.
Yeah.
We see it on some structural issues which create all anger and kind of populist parties, because we have a mechanisms that keeps the power in the middle, and on these issues will always represent the interest of especially higher educated people.
Well, I mean, it's also partly misrepresenting what people actually think about issues such as European Union. I mean, I think support for our membership of the European is relatively high, and we shouldn't be listening only to those people.
Sure. Well, no problem.
That's just so because he had to do it in 2 sentences, it was a bit.
Sure.
Okay.
Try to make to bring some discussion to the table.
No, but it's of course, Aren't you worried that some of the parties people in the Netherlands really say that they feel left out and not represented? You started your analysis with that you are worried about that.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's those people that don't even bother to show up anymore, and that this is disproportionately distributed amongst the different stratas of society.
Yeah.
The other part, I think, the Dutch system is relatively open in its parliamentary representation, and it's very fragmented as a result, which has its values in terms of representation, but has its disadvantages in terms of effective government and also the clarity. Someone mentioned this earlier today. Is it possible to vote out the government? I thought it wasn't possible. I think it was you. And that's exactly what Siewert is addressing, that because of this coalition formation, you need 4 parties to even get above the threshold of 50% plus 1, makes it increasingly difficult for a clear course.
Laatste interventie.
About engagement, why don't I have 10 votes to be attached or assigned to parties? Because every time I vote, I am entitled to make one red dot once in 4 years, no idea what happens afterward. And
Clear.
So we've got an app for that.
And it's called
10 votes minimal.
We did it in 2012. It was called the Vote Breaker, and what we did was actually people could get 10 votes and place in all kind of parties, and we would you put it in on your phone, and then with an algorithm, we make it possible that if everybody votes for one party, in the end, the complete combination of all your votes was represented. So we shifted 1 seat, and in the end, 250,000 people participated. So I think all those kind of experiments are really interesting, although they are small.
Still in the niche, but that the niche is important for reform.
I think the most important thing is to give you 2 votes. One to give the executive power a mandate, and one to give those that will control the executive power a vote. And that makes it also easier for Parliament to play its controlling role and actually serves as a check rather than just sort of buttressing the executive power.
Do you think that debate, because that would be part of a democratic reform debate, would that be on the agenda, you think?
We've been trying to get this on the agenda ever since 1966,
No, that's why I'm asking.
and it's still there. It's
Yeah.
just not very high on the agenda. But I think we should keep the conversation going, definitely, and I'm still in favor.
Well, I would like also to have 10 votes for you, but then not just for Parliament, but also for all these other organizations, for education, for health, for all this housing, for all these institutions that make up so much of people's lives
Yes.
every day.
Yes.
But therefore, we may conclude that democracy works best on small groups. Because on the kitchen table with my wife and
You always
children, I
win.
can decide the holiday destination, but when the neighbors have to pay as well and they join us, we have problems already.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
You know, Doc feels that democracy is something you do.
the Swiss
Yeah.
cantons work better in a democratic way than our country, and I think the European Union is much, much too big to work in a democratic way. I think
Well,
it's an illusion.
We're not going to talk about the scale anymore, but thank you so much for your intervention. I'm going to go to the concluding remarks because it's 10:03. And for those of you who are here for the first time, it's like I don't know, a stream of a river which goes that way and then goes that way. But if somebody wrote notes and made notes, you'll see that there have been many suggestions for reform at this table. I mean, a real broad participatory process on the value of the Constitution, the idea that you should have much more direct democracy procedures into our system, and so on. But so we have to come to a concluding end. What do you hope for to make what would be your first really urgent call to make the Dutch democracy, which is already very resilient,
Well, I
even
think we
more
should,
resilient?
besides cherishing that a little bit more sometimes,
Yeah,
and also
being aware of it, okay.
at the presentation of the IDEA report, Professor Sarah de Lange said democracy is organized conflict.
Yes.
So I think, and conflict is also about the rules that should govern a democracy. So I think that is an important thing to remember, and I think introducing that a little bit more into our educational system and the way we raise ourselves and our children with that attitude, with this resilient attitude that you mentioned, I think that would be my call.
Yes.
Well, I would agree on that. You know, I saw in a survey once that a majority of Dutch people think that our judicial system is actually a rule by jury, because that's what they see on television, and that I really got shocked by that, and I thought people know so little about the basics of our own system, and we should really, really engage them more in that.
Yeah.
So I would start just by trying to raise the political efficacy of people. So the trust that people have in their own political effectiveness, and broaden the base of people that are actively participating in democracy, because I think in the end that's the power of democracy, as much citizens as possible participating in our great system.
And yeah, thank you so much. I'm just looking at Maluki because you didn't go to you didn't want to?
Yes, sorry.
Because of course,
You want me to have
a final remark, because you were one of the people who were in the preparation session this afternoon, which we
maybe
missed.
2 point then. I look at
As concluding remarks, yes.
Concluding a small question. I'd like to put it to Yvonne Zunderop. I was just on your Twitter account,
Okay.
and you just quote Joris Luijendijk,
Yes.
and saying, Luijendijk explained, it will be very interesting to involve representatives of beliefs in the Netherlands to speak about a universal right. A universal
Exactly.
right are the background of our constitution. And you have just this small word, interesting. So I'm very interested. Why do you find this one?
Oh, okay, okay.
No.
I will explain to you after.
Yes.
At the bar.
That's really.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. That is really a conversation at the bar.
Okay.
Yeah.
My conclusion will be also thinking of what Yvonne said about involving citizens. And I had to think, I will quote then the title of this recent research from our Council for Public Administration. There is more. Democracy is more than politics.
Yes.
And I think it's very important what you say. People like us that are busy in social care, in public housing, in education, disabled, women, minorities, how can you get power? We think these layers of democracy.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Was kind of like, yeah, thank you for your concluding remarks. Dear audience, can you give this panel and the panel of the first round a big applause? Thank you, thank you.
And Natasha.
Of course, this is a conversation which always has a third round. We'll do that at the bar. But we also always, at the end, ask you to, well, if you're interested in discussions like these, then there is a Dutch evening called Baas in Eigen Huis, who has the right to the city, about communities in neighborhoods. Well, of course, one of the oldest discussion in Dutch society, city versus the countryside, discussion about that. And the third is, a Dutch idea of, or an initiative to co-create with citizens and government. Okay, if you're interested, you can go to these evenings. This is already the new year. Before that, we still have Christmas and happy, yeah, okay. Anyway, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Idea, for your fantastic report and your inspiration to talk about this the entire evening. Good luck with your global tour. I hope it's fun. And thank you for your report. Thank you. Thank you.